Hi everyone. First of all, I'd just like to thank you all for joining me for this author interview for our online book launch for Deadly Mist, which is the second thriller in my Amy Robertson series. For those of you who don't know me, or more to the point, don't know me as a writer, here's a snapshot about my work. I've been writing since I was about 5 or 6 years old, and I actually come from a family of writers. On my father's side, we have an ancestor who was involved in producing South Africa's first ever newspaper with Thomas Pringle in Grahamstown in the Eastern Cape. So there really is printer's ink in all our veins. I've relatives who are journalists and poets, and some who work in the media field as well. I received an award for a poem I wrote in our school magazine during my final years at school from the South African Council for English Education, so it was a given that at some point in my life I would write. After I left school, actually to work as a legal secretary, I began submitting freelance articles to newspapers and magazines. Then when I was in my early 20s, I started hiking and backpacking, camping and bird watching, and suddenly I had lots to write about. They always say that you should write about what you know. So I began submitting articles about the trips I went on to outdoor magazines in South Africa, and I finally published my first article about a trip to Seychlabetevi National Park in Lesotho in about the mid-1990s. After that, I wrote for several South African publications, and I was twice involved in updating the Fodor's Guide to Southern Africa, which included writing a new chapter on Swaziland for the guide. Then about 10 years ago, I began producing my own digital magazines, which had long been a dream of mine since I was in my teens, and the magazines focused on birding, wildlife and conservation. Probably my most successful offering was an e-magazine called Urban Eco Life, which is about sustainable living. It was free and my husband very kindly supported it. However, eventually he couldn't support it any longer, and I was unable to find any more other sponsors or funding sources, so we had to close it. I'm now producing Organics Africa, which is an e-magazine aiming to spread more information about organic growing, food, urban birds, and we cover a bit of sustainable living as well. So that's enough about me. Let's talk about the book. So when it comes to novels, lots of people want to know what your inspiration was. And with regards to Deadly Mist, several things actually inspired the novel. Ever since studying nature conservation about 15 years ago, and also as a result of producing the e-magazines, I've become very aware of just how many toxins are present in our environment. I read a report the other day which stated that the average person is now exposed to something around 11,000 chemicals every single day. A lot of these are toxic, and several are also novel or new toxins, so no one really knows what their ultimate effects are on human beings, other organisms, or the environment for that matter. Many of these toxins are used in manufacturing, but also in commercial agriculture to grow food crops, and the Deadly Mist aims to highlight these issues. A number of years ago, I also read a news article about school children in Hoedspruit. It's a small town in the Limpopo province, and these children became ill as a result of crop spraying in the area. Subtropical fruit orchards have gradually been replacing the natural land right up to the buffer zone around the Kruger National Park and the private reserves there. 15 years ago, when I was involved in the South African tourist industry and I was visiting the area virtually every week, this transformation was already starting, with a lot of the game farms being ploughed up to make way for subtropical fruit orchards. And this is something that I mention in the book as well. So for those of you who want to know something about my characters, you probably want to know who Amy Robertson is. She's the main character in what I hope will become a series of books, each one covering a different environmental or conservation issue. And her character is loosely based on my own experiences as a freelance environmental and conservation writer. I cover and have covered a lot of these stories when doing my e-magazines, and I've drawn on some of the experiences I had when creating Amy Robertson's character. So a lot of the search and the way she conducts her interviews are authentic, although they don't necessarily mirror any of my own personal experiences. They really just form a basis for the character. If you're wondering, she's named for my niece, who's also an Amy, but her name is spelled differently. And the surname is from my favorite winery in South Africa, Robinson's Winery, who produce a superb red Merlot that's probably one of my favorite wines. I know on the author metrics I'm on, they always talk about how you should name your characters, so that's how Amy Robertson got her name. People, you're probably wondering why I chose hippos as my primary target for the poisoning incidents that start happening in the Lowveld in the book. And I chose them because they're reputed to be the most dangerous animals in Africa. They get out of the water to feed in the evenings, and that's when they can become vulnerable to agricultural poisons. I've actually done quite a lot of river rafting, and I've worked in areas where there are hippos when I was doing environmental education, and we always had to be very careful about these animals when we were doing activities on the rivers, and also at night. You know, we had to make sure that all the gates were closed and the hippos couldn't get into the area where we had the dormitories and the public areas. I actually read an article in a Zambian newspaper about hippos who died after feeding on grass adjacent to some small-scale farms where the crops had been sprayed with a very hectic pesticide. I think it might have been carbofuran. This is deadly, and it's actually one of the poisons that's used to kill so-called problem wildlife in Africa. Incidentally, there's no such thing as problem wildlife. The animals are just doing what comes naturally, but in my opinion, they are problem people. I've based the description of the hippo attack that occurs in round about chapter 4 from a chapter in James Clark's very interesting book about human-wildlife conflict in Africa. It's called Save Me from the Lion's Mouth. It's a very interesting book, and I think it's still available from Straight Nature if anyone has an interest in these issues and you want to find out a bit more. Is there such a pesticide as the one you describe in your book? Well, actually no, but in the course of my research I did discover that there are some very dangerous substances out there being used actually by the agricultural sector in South Africa, things like carbofuran, which I've mentioned. This has been banned in South Africa according to media reports, but it's still being sold and registered as an agricultural remedy. There's also temic, which I mention in the book, and these substances are still coming into the country, however, on the black market, so they are available, and there are some that are even sold unlabeled at street markets, which I have a scene in the book where we talk about that. And in fact, I got the idea because there was an undercover SABC News expose on the subject, which I saw when I was doing my research. You mentioned poisoning of birds of prey in your book. How big a problem is this in South Africa? So in my opinion, it's a major problem. Basically, what happens is this occurs when non-target animals or birds unintentionally become victims of poisoning. For example, you might have a landowner who puts out a carcass laced with poison to kill an animal such as a jackal that's preying on his chickens or lambs, and a vulture or a bird of prey will also feed on the carcass because it doesn't know that it's not supposed to do that, and then it will succumb to poisoning, this is called secondary poisoning. And there's quite a lot of this happening now in Africa, and it's one of the reasons why vultures and some other birds of prey are threatened. And it's also thought to be one of the reasons why raptors are so much reduced outside of protected areas. The book also touches on droughts and water issues in South Africa. So basically, South Africa has always been subject to drought and flood cycles. It used to be 10 years of drought followed by 10 years of floods. But under climate change, it's much more severe, and the country is becoming much, much drier. The Lowveld is currently in the grip of a severe drought, and there are many other parts of South Africa that are also having severe droughts at the moment, especially in the Cape provinces. So it's a very big issue in South Africa at the moment. 98% of our water resources are already being used, mostly by agriculture, but there are also knock-on effects for other sectors such as tourism, which I also mention in the book. Water shedding during droughts, which is when municipal water is switched off for long periods at a time, is also becoming more prevalent as dams dry up. Your book also touches on mining issues, which is right. It's not a mining book per se, but Mpumalanga, which is where the book is set, has essentially become a mining province. Over 60% of the land area is now either being mined or under application for new mines. And there are many NGOs who are working with and highlighting the impacts of mining on so-called mining-affected communities. Amy's fiancé in the book and future books is Logan Springfield, And in this particular book, he's working for an NGO and he's exposed to some of these issues. And just as a matter of interest, the historic town of Vogelnrest really is threatened at the moment by a gold mine that wants to reopen after closing down about 30 or 40 years ago. So that is something that is ongoing and that is mentioned in some of the book. And then the book also covers organic versus commercial farming issues. It's my personal belief that we need to find a new way of growing our food. I read somewhere recently that there are only 60 harvests left worldwide because of the rampant use of biocides and industrial fertilizers, which has compromised the land, soils and natural systems, and it's very, very severe. Organic farmers, however, often face stiff opposition, including having to deal with many myths about organic farming, a lot of which are simply not true. One of my characters, Tommy De Beer, is an organic farmer, and he highlights some of the problems. I have a scene where he discusses this with Amy Robertson after a Farmers Association meeting in the book. In fact, the Rodale Institute in Pennsylvania in the United States has actually done a 10-year study on organic versus commercial farming, and they found that organic farming actually compared very favorably and did less environmental harm than conventional farming. So what is the overall takeaway from Deadly Mist? I think the book illustrates how several factors often collide to create multiple stacked impacts. One of my advanced readers actually mentioned in a review that Deadly Mist represents the collision of capitalism, tourism and the ecology, and this sort of situation is very prevalent in many areas of life today. Everything is linked and nothing actually occurs in a vacuum. So finally, last but not least, where can folk buy Deadly Mist? During the launch, it's only going to be available through my online shop on my website, and we're also looking at online stores such as Apple, Kobo and the imprints, as I mentioned. These aren't available this weekend due to technical issues. Probably sometime next week these books will be available at online retailers as well. If you sign up for my mailing list, then I'll be able to give you a heads up once I get the notifications that the books are available on those platforms. All the prices are on the websites and on the platforms, and some online stores for South Africans who are concerned about exchange rate fluctuations. The payment options, if the book picks up that you're in South Africa, it will actually give you payment options in rands. These will fluctuate a little bit depending on exchange rates, and that's pretty much it. I hope you will enjoy our launch, and thank you very much for participating. I will see you all back at 2 o'clock for the virtual book signing. Thank you.